Hello there, welcome along to this video with me, Justin Brierley, filmed right here in our office, in our home in Surrey. Sorry we can't be together in person, but I hope that you enjoy this video, which is part of a series that I was planning to present anyway at Spring Harvest, looking at reasons for faith, Christianity, and in this particular case, asking the question, how did the new atheism grow old? And I'll explain more about that in a moment's time. I present a faith debate show every weekend on Premier Christian Radio. It's called Unbelievable, and I bring Christians and non-Christians together to debate issues around faith and belief, because I believe Christianity can stand up on its own 2 feet, and that it's a good way actually to get into the conversation, to make Christianity relevant to people outside of the church, is by hosting these kinds of conversations that matter. In the process, we've also launched things like the regular conference, the annual conference that takes place in London. We've done debate events all over the country and in other parts of the world. And I wrote a book called Unbelievable: Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. And that really tells the story of the show, gives my case for faith, and I hope in the process helps many people, both Christians and non-Christians, to see that there is a rational case to be made for Christianity. Now, over the years, we've had lots and lots of atheists on the programme as we've done these debates, where I've sat down and moderated conversations between leading Christians and well-known atheists. And that's given me a little bit of an idea of what's going on in the bigger picture when it comes to secularism and atheism in the UK and worldwide. Now, I don't have a particularly grand thesis on this. I haven't written a book about this. All I'm going to be sharing is, to some extent, an overview of how I've seen the conversation shift from what was, if you like, quite a dogmatic form of atheism to something that's actually quite different and quite interesting today. The show began really around the time that the new atheism was really gathering up a head of steam. If you're not familiar with what I mean by the new atheism, well, it's typically represented by characters like Richard Dawkins, who's an Oxford biologist, and he wrote a best-selling book back in, I think, around 2005, I have a feeling, called The God's Delusion, in which essentially he argued that religion is all fairy tales, we need to trust science now, and the sooner we get rid of religion, the better. And he was, of course, joined in that endeavour by people like Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens. He wrote that religion is not just false, it's also evil. He had a best-selling book called Why Religion Poisons Everything, or God is Not Great, Why Religion Poisons Everything. So these were a couple of the characters in this so-called new atheist movement. And the show really dealt a great deal for a long time, and still does to some extent, with those kinds of objections, those kinds of characters. Probably the zenith of this movement was in, I think, 2010, around the time of the so-called atheist bus campaign. I don't know if you remember this, but there were a number of buses going around London declaring there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. This was a very evangelistic form of atheism, and that was the way it was for quite a while. I think, though, that movement has really waned now. These days, most of the time when I talk to people and the subject of Richard Dawkins comes up, they'll say, well, I'm not an atheist like Richard Dawkins. That's the usual kind of framework in which he's represented these days. And I think to some extent, although you'll still find online a lot of that rhetoric and angry kind of vilification of Christianity and so on, actually in the more sort of general public domain, I think the conversation has moved on. And I think there's a few reasons for that. The movement, for starters, split. I mean, if you could call it a movement to begin with, the new atheist movement had its sort of high priests and its doctrines and its sacred scriptures, but like all church or religious movements, it split between those who wanted to take it in one direction, who thought that actually atheism should stand for all these issues around human rights and social justice, and others who said, no, this is just about free thinking and freedom of speech and that kind of thing, freedom of thought. And there was a definite split in the movement, and both sides started falling out with each other and blogging against each other, and people got disinvited from conferences because it was felt that such and such had said something that was out of keeping with the way that their atheist movement should run. And so the movement experienced a sort of a split over a couple of years, which left lots of different camps doing their own thing. There were moral failures as well among some of the chief adherents. Some well-known atheist speakers out in the USA got caught in compromising situations or doing things at some of these atheist conferences that feminists felt were wrong and were not treating women well. So there were moral issues. There were also a number of gaffes, frankly, from Richard Dawkins himself on Twitter, where he would frequently put his foot in it in some way or another, make some comment that a lot of people found offensive and then try to defend himself. And so to some extent, the whole thing began to look a little bit like, no one really knew what was going on, and there was no real sort of steering of this ship. So in the end, I think to some extent, a lot of people said, okay, that was for then. We need to move on from some of that stuff. And a lot of people, of course, noticed that this particular movement tended to be led by very white, privileged men. And a lot of people got tired of seeing that kind of sort of way of seeing things as the dominant one in the atheist conversation. Frankly, a lot of people got tired of the dogmatism of it as well. There was a sort of shrill, hectoring tone very often to the videos and the books and the appearances of these well-known atheist figures. And people, I think, in the end, felt that it was just another form of fundamentalism, another form of dogmatism, and people got a bit tired of that. One of the things that I think happened as well is that while they were happy to tear down religion, the new atheists, and say, this is false, you shouldn't, trust in this anymore, we've got science now, they failed to put anything in its place that actually gave people purpose and meaning. One of the quotes that I sometimes quote from Richard Dawkins in one of his books, he says, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." And well, that's not really a way for people to live their life, is the fact of it. People can't live into that kind of a story where there's no good, no evil, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And so I think the real problem with the new atheism was that it tore religion down, but didn't give people a narrative, a meaning to actually live their lives into. And when that happens, when you simply tear away the foundations, people go off in all kinds of interesting and strange directions very often. I think we're living right now in a meaning crisis, both in the UK and worldwide. I looked up some statistics recently, and a staggering 9 in 10 young Brits believe that their life lacks purpose, according to a new study. This was a UK-wide survey which revealed the extent to which the younger generation feel disillusioned. The majority, 89% of 16 to 29-year-olds claiming their life lacks purpose or meaning. That's a significant problem, and it's one that I don't think the new atheism in any way really addressed. You go to the US, and the rate of US adolescents and young adults dying of suicide has reached its highest level in nearly 2 decades, according to a report that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. In 2017, there were 47% more suicides among people aged 15 to 19 than in the year 2000. And with more than 6,200 suicides among people aged 15 to 24, suicide ranked as the second leading cause of death for people in that age group in 2017, trailing behind things like motor vehicle accidents. So the statistics tell us that there's a crisis of meaning. People don't know what to live for anymore. Suicide, anxiety, depression rates are rocketing. And we see that with social media statistics as well, don't we? We've seen the way that social media, the smartphone generation, so on, has actually pressed the buttons and increased actually the amount of anxiety, depression, and even suicide potentially among young people. And the point of all this is that despite us having all of this technology and science at our fingertips, we still don't seem to be able to create meaning for ourselves in the absence of a bigger narrative. And that's what Christianity offered. Now, we live, it's said, in a post-Christian world, a post-Christian society in the West. And while atheism has been part of what has tried to tear away those foundations of the story we live in, it hasn't replaced it with anything. And so people are wandering, to some extent, in a sense of meaninglessness. And that's what's contributing, I think, to some of these statistics I've been mentioning. Now, of course, people do try to put other things in their place. I think we are, in some sense, inveterately religious, and I'll come back to that shortly. But one of the things that I've noticed in the last few years is a return to the questioning and a conversation around whether we were too quick to dismiss religion altogether, even among secular circles. So there's been a new phenomenon called the intellectual dark web. It sounds rather ominous and threatening, but really it's a loose collaboration of thinkers from the secular and sometimes the religious world who are asking again the questions about how do we live now? How do we get meaning and purpose in a scientific technological age? Probably the best known person in this IDW, this intellectual dark web, is Jordan Peterson, who sort of burst onto the scene just over 2 years ago. There was a viral video of him being interviewed by Cathy Newman on Channel 4 News. And if you haven't seen it, go and check it out. Just look for Jordan Peterson, Cathy Newman, and you'll see that this is quite an unusual guy. He's a deep thinker. He's a psychologist, a clinical psychologist from Canada, and he has this very unique approach to life in which he asks big questions, and he's very critical of some of the answers that the new atheism have given. Now, he's not traditionally religious himself, though a lot of what he says, and his book 12 Rules for Life was full of it, has its roots in the Bible, in the Christian story. And he seems to be pointing people back again to the question of where we come from, what are we living for, and what could be behind it all. And I was able to get him on my show back in 2018. It was part of a series that we launched at the time called The Big Conversation from Unbelievable, a special video debate series. And it was very interesting to sit down with him and an atheist psychologist, and for Jordan Peterson to essentially act the Christian apologist to a great degree. He was happy to defend the role of God and the fact that God gives a meaning in people's lives and the way that religion has provided that kind of framework in people's lives. Here's a little clip from that show.
I do believe that the biblical texts are foundational. I believe it in the Nietzschean sense. And, Nietzsche, of course, announced famously in the late 1800s that God was dead. And the typical rationalist atheist regards that as a triumphalist proclamation. But that wasn't that for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche knew perfectly well and said immediately afterward that the consequences of that was going to be bloody catastrophe because everything was going to fall. And he predicted the rise of communism, for example, and the deaths of tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the death of God. Because Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, that even though it may stay aloft in midair like a cartoon character that's wandered off a cliff for some period of time, that it will inevitably crumble and that it will be replaced by something that's perhaps far worse. Now, Nietzsche hoped it would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his psyche, for example, which I think is a doomed enterprise. But he knew that in the interval, it would be replaced by both nihilism and by communist totalitarianism, which is a hell of a prediction because it was done like 40 years before the events actually unfolded.
Well, so, you can see it that way, but if that is the case, why do we have evidence that the most dysfunctional societies today are the most religious? And for example, in the United States of America, the higher, if you go across different states, the higher belief in God is proclaimed belief in God, whatever you think that means, the more murders, suicide, marital breakdown, various measures of dysfunctional society are.
Well, it depends on how you define religion in part. I mean, first of all, America is a very religious country. And to think of it as a country that's doing worse than other countries in the world is just not the case.
Well, its incarceration rate is higher than any other.
Well, true, but so is its standard of living and its what would you say, ability to provide the basic essentials of life for people and the essential freedoms that go along with that. You wouldn't compare that to an African dictatorship.
No. But most of these studies have been done only in developed societies. But there, if you look at income inequality, that's much worse in the States. So yes, a lot of people in the States have a very high standard of living, but the poorest are really poor.
Yes, well, income inequality.
with Obamacare being dismantled and so on.
Well,
but nevertheless, let me go back to that point. We know that more dysfunctional societies have higher proclaimed belief, higher attendance in church, and so on. Now, this doesn't fit with what you were saying. Now, Nietzsche's ideas are very profound and interesting, but I just want to stop you from saying that he was absolutely right about somehow if we get rid of God, we're going to be worse, because we have very well-functioning societies in Scandinavia,
we were
for
pretty
example.
bad in the 20th century.
Oh, we were, yes. People were.
And we could easily drift that way again.
And there have been terrible bad things done in the name of God, and there have been terrible bad things done in the name of communism and atheism. I don't think we can. I don't want to weigh them up.
I'll weigh them up.
You'll weigh them up and you'll say...
No problem.
But then you have to go against this evidence that I've just stated.
Jordan, come back on this evidence. I mean, obviously, from her perspective, Sue feels like actually we've got pretty stable societies that are increasingly secular these days. So perhaps Nietzsche was wrong, and in fact, we're not going to see this moral
I would say
decay.
they're stable to the degree that they're actually not secular. And this is also a Nietzschean observation, and a Dostoevskian observation for that matter, is that we're living on the corpse of our ancestors, like we always have. That's a very old idea. But that stops being nourishing and starts to become rotten unless you replenish it. And I don't think we are replenishing it. We're in danger of we're living on borrowed time and in danger of running out of it. I think that the reason that the Western societies essentially work quite well is because they act out a Judeo-Christian ethic, and one that's essentially predicated on utmost regard for the sovereignty of the individual. So the individual is sovereign in relationship to the state, which is a remarkable idea, and one that's fundamentally religious in its essence, in my mode of thinking, and that's also predicated on honest speech. And there's other predicates as well, but those are religious predicates in my estimation.
Jordan Peterson has amassed a huge following online, and this is not a following of academics. These are young people, often young men in their 20s and 30s, who are looking for meaning, who have realized that their life isn't what they were promised by the technology and social media that they live in. And they don't want to simply be people who sit in their pajamas and play computer games in their basement for the whole of their life. They want to give their life direction and purpose. And Jordan Peterson has become a sort of father figure almost to them. And it's been interesting to see the impact of that. And it suggests that maybe there's something in this religious thing after all. Maybe we were too quick to throw out the ideas of religion. Doesn't mean it's true, but it's interesting that people are returning to the question of whether we've lost something by losing religion. And I've seen in the course of doing my show, as we've started to have conversations with people like Jordan Peterson, that a lot of other people have joined that conversation as well. People who are unsatisfied with the new atheist answers of saying you simply got to forget religion, focus on science, and everything will be okay that way. People who are realizing actually we need more than that in order for life to be lived in a meaningful way. One of those people was Dean, who's a listener out in Australia, who started listening to the show after I got Jordan Peterson on the programme. And he's been through a really interesting period. He would have described himself at one time as quite a staunch atheist, but he's realised actually he needs more in his life than that. And by listening to some of the conversations we've been hosting on the show, he's started to change his mind and is on a journey of sorts. He's been quite open about it. He blogged about it as well and sent me the link. And this is some of what he wrote. Dean said, "I'm still trying to work this out even as I write this, so I may return to it in the future. But the fact that I am trying to work this out is something of a revelation for me. I find it difficult to argue that Christianity has not been a significant influence in our understanding of the moral landscape. Everything we know about morality and ethics, at least in the Western context, has arisen out of Christianity. Sure, atheists will argue that morality and ethics are their own entities, observable and practiced by Christians and non-Christians alike, but it seems reasonable to credit their foundation in Christianity. But where did this all leave me? An individual, unsure, arguably unknowledgeable, with a long history of doubt, which I can't readily observe. I can only appreciate the existence of the show Unbelievable and its mission to bring together and debate significant topics in the spirit of good faith. Unbelievable is one of the richest learning experiences I've ever encountered, and it's encouraging me to see the world and my place in it more deeply and considerately than I've ever before. Will it lead me to a wholesale embrace of Christianity? It may, and it may not. I'm not sure if that's the goal for me at this point, but I do find myself at the beginning of something new with unbelievable in hand as a touchstone. I've been really encouraged to receive messages like that from people like Dean, who are finding that actually there is a bigger conversation to step into, that we don't simply have to take the answers of the new atheism from 10 years ago, if you like, but maybe it's worth investigating this whole Christianity thing again. The intellectual dark web is also an interesting phenomenon because it's seen as very anti-political correctness, and it tends to be anti what are sometimes called woke ideologies. They believe that the progressive left has gone too far in making everything about these identity groups, whether it be race or gender or trans issues or sexuality. They say the fact that these things are being treated almost as religious items in themselves, where people can be excommunicated and offenders will be banished from Twitter and all that sort of thing. They say that's stifling freedom of speech and academic integrity. And so this movement has styled itself on a kind of a return to freedom of speech and having honest conversations that aren't bogged down in these particular ideologies that can't be questioned. It's created something of a backlash in a way, these particular ways of looking at the world. Even well-known characters like J.K. Rowling, the creator of the Harry Potter series, have been caught up in it. I think just before Christmas, she tweeted something defending Maya Forstater, who was a woman who lost her job because she had objections to having to address people who are transgender and treat them exactly, as the gender they claim they want to be in the role of her job. And this has led J.K. Rowling to tweet in her defense saying people can do what they want and be what they want, but why should a woman lose her job just simply for having an opinion on this? And that led to a huge backlash against J.K. Rowling because these are very sensitive issues to be speaking into. And as I say, treated almost with a religious fervour by those who are invested in them. And I think, interestingly, this has created an interesting amount of common ground with other Christians who are also concerned at the erosion of freedom of speech. So a lot of the conversations I've been hosting, interestingly, on my show with non-Christians, with skeptics, with atheists from the intellectual dark web have actually been quite open to the way Christians see things, because they see them, if you like, as a partner in pushing against this kind of politically correct sort of ideology. Some of the characters who are involved in this, I could mention Brett Weinstein. I had him on the programme in a conversation with Alistair McGrath. Brett Weinstein is a biology professor, but he was sort of ousted from his university in the States because he wasn't prepared to bow to the politically correct sort of way that the students wanted things to be done there. Had interesting conversations with him about the fact that he sees religion as a hugely important part of how we understand life, even though he isn't himself a believer. Dave Rubin is a talk show host online on YouTube out in the USA, has a huge following and hosts some of these folks from the intellectual dark web. Again, he has described himself in the past as an atheist, but he's been reinvestigating his Jewish roots and even Christianity. And I sat down for him for a live debate show. Well, it wasn't a debate, it was much more a friendly conversation, actually, with Christian thinker John Lennox in the USA last year. And again, someone who's starting to rediscover the value of religion and looking into it, genuinely interested to know whether actually this might have answers that he originally hadn't considered. And then someone I've had on the show a few times now, Tom Holland, very interesting character. He's a popular historian. He's written best-selling books on the history of the Greek and Roman empires and ancient culture. But his most recent book, published at the end of last year, is Dominion. And it's all about the way that we in the West owe all of our values and the things we hold dear to our Christian heritage, specifically to the idea of a slave who was crucified who claimed to be God, and the way that that completely changed the world from that point onwards. It's an extraordinary book. It's a sort of magisterial in scope. It covers 2,000 years of history and the way everything changed because of Christianity. And Tom Holland is particularly hacked off with humanists and atheists who claim that these human values we hold dear today simply came out of a vacuum. He says we are in so many ways culturally indebted to Christianity, but we don't realize it. Here's another little clip of him talking to a biblical scholar N.T. Wright about how he changed his mind about Christianity.
Cicero's great contemporary Caesar is, by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's kind of promoting it. And so when he holds his triumph, people are going through the streets of Rome carrying billboards, boasting about how many people he's killed. And this is a really terrifyingly alien world. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that it is built on systematic exploitation. So the entire economy is founded on slave labor.
Right.
The sexual economy is founded on the absolute right of free Roman males to have sex with anyone that they want, any way that they like. And in almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And so this worried me more and more. And it was kind of like, I was thinking, well, you know, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And so where am I coming from? And it was like a kind of itch, you know, you get on your back and you can't find it. And this was then enhanced for me by then writing a book about late antiquity and the emergence of Islam from the late religious the religious and imperial context of late antiquity, and again finding in Islam a profound quality of the alien. That, you know, there were aspects of Islam that were very familiar, but there were many aspects of it that again seemed deeply alien. And I began to realize that actually in almost every way I am Christian. And I began to realize that actually Paul, although in many ways he seems a much less familiar figure than Cicero, the kind of, you know, urbane man with his property problems. You know, Paul never had any property; he just made tents. Yes. That in almost every, you know, what is it, seven? That is the 7 letters that are people conventionally people absolutely accept. That, you know, and as Tom Wright was saying, you know, this is not a very lengthy amount of writing, but compacted into this very, very small amount of writing was almost everything that explains the modern world.
Well, the Western world, as we take for granted.
But also the way that the West has then moved on to shape, you know, concepts like international law, for instance. So the fact, you know, concepts of human rights, all these kind of things, ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul.
Some of the humanists
Paul really
and atheists,
is, you know, his letters, I think, are, along with the 4 Gospels, the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world.
When you penned that article, I think it was for the New Statesman, where you said what I got wrong, and you sort of came out, as it were, and said, as far as my values and, you know, background are concerned, I am a Christian. It was interesting to see the response to that, because I saw lots of atheists and humanists saying, oh, hang on, you know, democracy, that goes back to the Greeks, you know, don't pretend that Christianity gave us everything we're grateful for. But you honestly think that actually people simply haven't appreciated just how much we owe to Judeo-Christian?
I think I mean, if we're talking of Paul, I think of him as a kind of depth charge, deep beneath the foundations of the classical world. And, you know, it's not anything that you particularly notice if you're, you know, in Corinth or Alexandria. And then you start feeling this kind of rippling outwards. And, you know, by the time you get to the 11th century in Latin Christendom, everything has changed. And you have this, I think essentially what Paul's significance is that he sets up ripple effects of revolution throughout Western history. So the 11th century, where with the Papal Revolution, essentially it establishes this idea that society has to be reborn, reconfigured, that vested interests have to be torn down. And then the Reformation, what we call the Reformation, is a further ripple effect of that, and the Enlightenment is a further ripple effect of that. And very interesting. You know, it spilled out so much that now in the 21st century, we don't even realize where these ripple effects are coming from. We just take them for granted.
I hope you enjoyed that clip. You can go and watch the whole of their conversation, by the way, over on the Unbelievable YouTube channel, or look up Tom Wright, Tom Holland, don't look for the Spider-Man version of Tom Holland. You're looking for the historian, or indeed you can download it on the Unbelievable podcast if you go back through the archive. But Tom Holland's an interesting guy because, he hasn't particularly claimed a Christian faith himself, though I'd say he's on an interesting journey, but he has seen the way that actually the atheist movement failed to really recognize the value that Christianity has given us over the years. And so people, I think, are starting to realize actually that we threw it all out a little while ago, and now they're realizing maybe we were too quick to do that. The conversation is changing. The new atheism is getting a bit old and tired for people like Tom Holland, Dave Rubin, Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, and many others. As I mentioned, people in some ways are inveterately religious. And so in the absence of a narrative like Christianity, they will often hold on to something else as their idol, as their point of worship, the focus and purpose of their life. And it could be a political system. It could be an ideology. These things become all consuming for people, as we know. But very often they let us down, don't they? And that's the point. So for me, I think that we stand at an interesting point in our culture where so many people are looking for something to give their life meaning and purpose. The answers given by the new atheism are lacking. They simply haven't actually changed the culture in the way that we were promised. If we simply get rid of religion and trust in science, we'll have this utopia opening up ahead of us. That hasn't happened. People can't agree on what that future should be or what's most important. At this point, I think the church, as much as we are speaking very often from the margins in our society today, we also have an immense opportunity in front of us because we are staring into this crisis of meaning. And we believe we know the person who can give ultimate meaning and ultimate purpose. And I think we're entering a period, and who knows what this coronavirus lockdown and all the rest of it might add into that, but a point at which people are opening up again to consider whether life is more than just the material things they have, the technology and the social media and the distractions of modern life, frankly. I had a really interesting conversation at the very beginning of this year with a journalist and writer and speaker called Douglas Murray. He's an interesting person because he describes himself as a Christian atheist, i.e. he doesn't believe, but he, like some of the people I've mentioned, believes that Christianity has essentially shaped us into being the culture we are today. And he has no truck with some of the hard atheists who he often counts as his friends and he knew Christopher Hitchens very well while he was alive. But nevertheless, he says that actually we really need to get a hold again of the values and the meaning that Christianity gave us. And he's very worried about a world in which we lose those things. He wrote a somewhat controversial book very recently on the whole issue of woke politics, trans identity, that kind of thing, called The Madness of Crowds, in which he critiques some of these various movements. And again, it was interesting to see the way that Christianity was brought into play in various ways in that book. I had him in conversation, as I say, recently with someone called Esther O'Reilly, who's a Christian thinker out in the USA. And I was struck by the honesty of Douglas as he talked about his deepest longings towards the end of the interview and whether he might ultimately consider Christianity again. He had lost his faith. He had a sort of faith of sorts, I think, up to his very early 20s. But here's just a clip as he talks about his own journey right now.
I suppose one thing that often holds, let's say, intellectuals back is, can I make this leap in a way that is intellectually satisfiable, or at least can I do it in a way that allows me not to have to volunteer up, even a part of my sense of intellectual honesty or self-worth or self-esteem, as it were. And that isn't the way, that genuinely isn't the way in which I view this. If I could, I would, but I can't.
Okay.
And I would just add to that. I mean, I was in great fortune to travel a fair amount in the Middle East in my life, and I was in Israel again earlier this year, and traveled around Galilee a lot. in particular. And I was, I came back, and a friend who recently converted to Catholicism in recent years said to me, did you feel anything?
Yeah.
And I said to him, some a very private thought I had, but I said I did on that trip to Galilee in particular. I did end up having one sentence in my head that I couldn't get out, which was, something happened here. Something happened here.
Something. Esther, our time is drawing to a close. It's been so interesting, and thank you, Douglas, for sharing so honestly as well. We've kind of given you a bit of a spiritual grilling towards the end here, and we do appreciate the
I've had worse.
The willingness to engage. Esther, any final thoughts as we close out today's show?
I think I would just close with a brief story about the one time that Winston Churchill met the American evangelist Billy Graham. This was in the 50s after the war, and Churchill, after the war, we now know, was in a quite bleak state, a rather depressed state. They had only a few minutes together. And at one point, Churchill looked Billy Graham in the eye and he said, "I'm a man without hope. Do you have any real hope for me?" And with some slight trepidation, perhaps, Graham pulled out his New Testament and he said, "Mr. Prime Minister, I have a good deal of hope." And I would say that it is that same hope that I would extend to you now, Douglas, because you seem like a man who could use it. And it truly is my sincere prayer that as Eliot has it, you would not cease from exploration. At the end of all your exploring would be to arrive where you started and know it for the first time. So that would be what I would leave you with.
One of my favorite bits of Eliot.
So I think the conversation is moving on. I think we're at a really interesting moment where people are asking new questions about whether there might be something in these religious texts, these doctrines, this narrative that Christianity gives to our life. Now, I believe, of course, that it's true, that it's not just useful for people's meaning and culture and that kind of thing. I believe actually Jesus Christ is who he said he was, that he died, that he rose again, and that changes everything. But I think we've got a unique opportunity to use this cultural moment that we're living in to present people with that story again, and to help them to see that this might be the answer that they've been looking for, because materialism isn't satisfying anyone. We have more technology, more social media, more Netflix than ever to distract us, but that hole in our heart, which only God can fill, is growing ever bigger. So I think Blaise Pascal was right when he said there's this God-shaped hole in the heart of every person which no created thing can satisfy, but only God made known through Jesus Christ. My prayer is that the church will step up in this moment, have those conversations that we need to have with people, have them confidently, graciously, but show people that actually there is a reason for all of this, that reason has a name, and that the person is love incarnate, Jesus Christ. Hope you've enjoyed the conversation today, the video that I've been able to bring to you. If you want, again, more from those video clips and some of those issues and shows that I've been mentioning, do feel free to check out the Unbelievable podcast. It goes with a question mark, Unbelievable question mark, if you're looking for it on podcast. Over on YouTube as well, we've got a channel where you can find loads of the videos and conversations I've been referencing. And if you want to go to our website, that's premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. For now, thank you very much. I'll see you next time.